Good morning, everybody. This week's quota is not very long, right? It's Vav, Zayin, and Ches. Zayin and Ches go together. Ches is a very specific din that has some ramifications, but that aren't, the specific din isn't super relevant because none of us are cooking kidneys anytime soon. But that's the halacha there. And Vav, as I mentioned last week, really belongs to last week's quota. It's connected to Daled Hay, and it's a specific din, halacha Vav, with respect to, good morning, Yemen. Vav is a specific din with respect to the question of grilling, which we spoke about last week, which is the transference of flavor between one item and another when they're not cooked together in a stew, in a liquid. And Vav is a specific din with respect to if one of the two items that are being grilled is very, very juicy, and then it kind of has the ability to cause more transference. That's discussed in halacha Vav. The beef, not a pun, of our subject this week is going to be halacha Zayin. Halacha Zayin is built on the following idea, which is really what's in a way, it's really the premise of the previous sifim, but it's specific to this sif. There's a din, there's an idea expressed by the Rashba. That's the source of this idea. It comes from the Rashba. And the din is like this. Even though the Shulchan Aruch does not use these words, this is the origin of the idea, which is Ein HaBolua Yotze Chaticha Chaticha below Rotev. Which means as follows. The transference of flavor from one thing to another, as we're already learning, is to a large degree dependent on liquid. Liquid causes a transference between one another. So when two items are touching, there's a very, very minimal transference, good morning, which we spoke about in the previous dinner. Very minimal transference, because there's there's always a little bit of juice when you have two pieces of touching, right? And then we said that Amos said we don't know the difference between fatty and lean, so we treat it as if it's transferring all the way. But now, take that same principle and apply it a level lower. Namely, where the piece itself isn't awesome. The piece itself is not something forbidden, but it absorbed something forbidden. So it isn't forbidden, the kosher piece of meat, but it's absorbed a little bit of non-kosher fat. And now it's sitting next to something else. Or touching something else, touching a kosher piece of meat. So now it's even a step down. There's no liquid, it's not in a pot stewing. And even the transference, which usually happens between one thing next to each other that's grilling, it's even lower because now it's not the actual meat piece of meat that's not kosher. The piece of meat now has to expel not just its own juice, but that which it absorbed, making it even a farther degree of being able to transfer. Clear? So it's not expelling its own flavor, which would be expelling its own flavor. Its own flavor would be 1 degree, which is the condition, which is the whole discussion of the last couple of systems and the conditions there to when something expels its own flavor. Here it's got to expel a flavor it absorbed, which is even lower degree. And here the Rashba makes this klal, Ein HaBolua Yotze Chaticha Chaticha below Rotev, which means that which is absorbed is not expelled from one piece to another without liquid in between. Which would mean, therefore, that's what the Shulchan Aruch rules, that if the piece of meat is not osir machmas atzmoi, that's the language in the Shulchan Aruch, it's not forbidden in and of itself. It's only forbidden because it absorbed something. Then it would not transfer by the fact that it's grilled next to something else or touching something else, unless there's a liquid, unless there is a gravy, there's a stew that's cooking. Otherwise, it would not expel the flavor that it absorbed. This is the principle from the Rashba. Clear? Now, what's the logic behind this? Explains the Rashba. Yeah, clear this din? Yeah? Agree with me? Yes, I'm actually good.
I'm just one. The Rashba is
Clash was a Rishon. Talking, I want to say 12th century. Yeah, I believe 12th century. 12th century Spanish halachic scholar. Shimon Shlomo ben Aderet. It's exactly Rabbi Shlomo ben Aderet, Rashba. Yeah, meaning it carries weight. It's not someone 50 years ago came up with something. It's universally discussed, or I believe even accepted law, as we'll see it's going to come up in the next in the quote after this, which I believe the next quote is going to be after Simchat Torah. The same law is going to be discussed again in Ches and Tes in a different context. Okay, so what's the rationale for the Rashba? How does he come to this conclusion that Ein Chaticha Yotze Chaticha B'li Rotev, that Ein HaBolua Yotze Chaticha B'li Rotev, that which is absorbed will not expel from one piece to another without liquid in between? How did he get to this? He says because if so, you'll never have the law of just removing the peel. Right? In the previous din, we had this law that if the lower is cold and the upper is hot, and one gets put into the other, and all you need to remove is just the amount of a peel. Yeah. Now, if every time something is absorbed, it has the ability to transfer further, then the peel absorbed, it transfers to that which is inside of it. That peel absorbs, which transfers to inside of it, which transfers to inside of it. If that which is absorbed can itself expel, it'll never stop at a point where it's just taking off a peel. So from the fact that the Chacham, the sages say that there are certain times when absorption only goes to a peel, doesn't go forward, means that absorption itself is not equal, it must expel. As if absorption expelled, you never have only removing a peel, because the peel would cause the piece next to it, the piece next to it, and so on and so forth. So the fact that the Chachamim say that there are certain times you're only taking off a peel, or only taking off the amount of kedei tila, the amount of a finger, was it 2 centimeters, whatever it was, it means that it could absorb, and then the absorption stops and doesn't continue. If that's the case, a piece of meat itself is not kosher. Itself is kosher, but absorbed non-kosher, it will not automatically expel to the piece next to it unless there is some liquid in between. Right? Okay. Now comes another interesting factor that gets involved in this. If something is Shulchan Aruch like this, if however the prohibited item that the piece of meat absorbed is liquidy, is fatty, then that itself serves as a self-contained liquid, and therefore can expel, right? Because the principle was that absorption will not be expelled unless there's liquid. But what if the absorption itself provides the liquid for its own ability to expel? And it does, as you've already learned in previous din, when there's something's fatty, it has more capacity to transfer flavor. So here too, if the piece of non-kosher meat absorbs fatty non-kosher issue, or just non-kosher fat, and that in and of itself will become the liquid that will allow it or make it capable of expelling flavor to the next thing. Yeah, that's what Shulchan Aruch says. Okay, so now what do you think the Ramah says about that? Anyone? What did Ramah say? He does not actually speak about it in the Sif, but based on what you know from the previous Sif from the Ramah, what would you say? Why?
Like you said with the fatty, and we're not so easy to
the Ramah, I'll say thank you. So the Ramah says we don't know the difference. We do not know. We accept that we don't know the exact line between fatty and lean, and therefore we treat every piece of meat as if it were fatty. So perhaps the same rule applies here, that if non-kosher is absorbed in a piece of meat, I don't know the difference between fatty and lean, and therefore no matter what, it always expels to the next piece, which would render almost this entire halacha obsolete, because this whole halacha is based on the premise that flavor will not be expelled unless there is liquid in between. And we're conceding, the Shulchan Aruch concedes, that if the flavor absorbed is itself fatty, that itself becomes the liquid by which it's going to expel. And if there are laws of the view that we don't know the difference between fatty and lean, then it's always going to expel. That's what you might have concluded. Yeah, we clear on that conclusion?
Which fat becomes a liquid though.
That's the point. So
So
so the Shulchan Aruch concedes that if the flavor that the kosher piece of meat absorbed is fatty, then it will have the ability to expel because that fat itself becomes the liquid by which it can expel. Now, if the Ramah is of the view that we don't know the difference or we don't treat anything different between fatty and lean, then any absorption, it would follow then that any absorption could expel because that in and of itself might be fatty in the Ramah's view, or we treat it like it's fatty even if it's not. Right? That's what you might have concluded. Clear? So comes the Shach and says, no. So here too is another example of where the Ramah will concede to the Shulchan Aruch's view that we can discern between fatty and non-fatty. You already had this before with respect to the piece popping out of the brine, right?
Yeah.
That if something is not brine, something is being pickled, that if there's a half of the piece is popping out. And we said that if it's fatty, the flavor of the negative, the non-kosher flavor of the pickling will travel up the piece of meat if it's fatty. But if it's not fatty, it won't. And then Amos there said, yep, I know the difference between fatty and non-fatty. And if you can tell that it's non-fatty, it's not going to travel up. So here too again, because it's a step down. See, it's an important principle. It's going to come up a lot in the Shulchan Aruch. You have to know what's a chumrah and what's a din. What's a law and what's a chumrah. And when you have a chumrah, you don't apply it universally. When you have another reason to be lenient, you won't apply the chumrah. Right?
The chumrah would be like less than a Rabbanan.
It's much less than a Rabbanan. The Rabbanan, the fatty thing transfers flavor. Maybe. So the chumrah is, we're going to be stringent, even when it's not fatty, because we don't know the difference between fatty and lean. But I'm not going to apply that stringency, especially when I'm looking at the piece of meat and I know it's not fatty, even though the Ramah told me to ignore that knowledge and say I don't know the difference between fatty and non-fatty. That's a chumrah. To ignore that piece of information is a chumrah, is a stringency. So the Ramah will concede that you're not going to apply that stringency when the case you're dealing with itself is of a lenient nature. So now we have case number two where that's true. Number one, earlier in the case of pickling, where a fatty piece of meat can transfer the flavor up outside the pickling, and then Ramah will say, I know that this is not fatty, it doesn't transfer. And the same thing here. Because to begin with, it's of a lesser nature because we're talking about not where the piece of meat itself is non-kosher, but we're only absorbed non-kosher. So now I'm going to be lenient and say that if it's not fatty, it will not transfer to the next piece of meat. Even though when the piece of meat itself is non-kosher, I will say, oh, I don't know if it's fatty or lean, it's transferred. Clear? Yeah? Clear on that? All right. It should be noted that there's another view, not mentioned in the Shulchan Aruch, by the Maharam of Rottenberg. Maharam of Rottenberg is also a Rishon from the end of the Rishonim. So he's in the, let's say, I want to say, in the 15th century, Maharam of Rottenberg, if I want to say that. He's a student of the Rosh. So it's a few generations after the Rashba. And he disagrees with the Rashba, and we disagrees with with the premise of the Shulchan Aruch. And he's of the view that even fatty non-kosher will not, even fatty flavor that's non-kosher, that's absorbed in a kosher meat, will not transfer unless it's liquid. He rejects this notion that the fatty absorption itself becomes the liquid by which it transfers. He rejects that notion, but we don't follow the Maharam Rottenberg, we follow the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah and all the Achronim who concur with that view. Okay, so far so clear? There's really two more halachas that we need to cover. It's a very small quota. Two more things that need to be covered. But before we continue, any questions? Everything clear? Want to ask something? Yeah, go ahead.
No, I just want you to kind of repeat what you said about the Maran.
Okay. The Shulchan Aruch was of the view. The premise again is HaBolua Yotze Chaticha Rotev. That which is absorbed will not exit from one piece to another without liquid in between. The Shulchan Aruch said that if the absorption itself was fatty, then that itself becomes the liquid by which it can transfer. So if the piece of meat is kosher, it absorbed non-kosher fat, and that will be the liquid by which it will transfer that non-kosher flavor to another piece of meat that's next to it, even though it's not in a stew. It's in its grilling. Yeah, okay. That was the Shulchan Aruch's view, and we said that the Ramah will accept that if we can observe that it's lean, we're going to treat it like lean. It doesn't transfer. The Maharam of Rottenberg is even more lenient and says, I'm sorry, I'm going to take the Rashba's view that flavor doesn't transfer without liquid as absolute. And even if the piece of meat absorbed fatty, non-kosher flavor, it will not transfer to another piece, even if it's fatty. That it doesn't in turn become the liquid by which it transfers. It has to have an exterior liquid that would cause the transfer. That's the Maran of Rotenberg's view. But again, we follow the Shulchan Aruch, not the Maran of Rotenberg. Clear? Okay.
When you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. When we say fatty, so we mean the first piece is the kosher piece, right? The
Yeah.
second piece is what's touching it to begin with.
Correct.
Which are we saying is fatty? The not kosher
Very
piece
good.
or the kosher piece?
Very good. So,
Or both?
that's a very good question. It's actually neither. It's the non-kosher flavor that the original piece absorbed is fatty. So it absorbed non-kosher fat, literally. Let's say fat from a non-kosher animal, or
Well-
non-kosher fats of a kosher animal.
So if the
That's
not
really
kosher piece were lean and the kosher piece were fatty, so
Oh,
is
very good
that
question.
a problem?
Very, very good question. So this is a good question. And one second, where did I see this? I actually saw that last night. Hold on a second, I want to find it for you. Yeah, so what happens if the original piece of meat is fatty, but the absorption is not fatty? So there's the fatty of the kosher meat.
Well, when you say the original piece of meat, you mean
The two pieces
they're
of meat,
not
they're both
kosher, or which is original?
So
Which
in
one
this
is the
case,
original, kosher or not kosher?
yeah, so in this case, both pieces of meat are inherently kosher, but one absorbed non-kosher. And the question
Right,
is,
but when it absorbed non-kosher, it absorbed from, and it had to, when we're talking about fatty between the not kosher and the kosher, right?
yes, so
to begin
that's what I
with.
was. Oh, so you're asking. This is what I understand you're asking. If you have two pieces of kosher meat, and the whole discussion here is that piece A absorbed non-kosher, and does piece
Right.
A, having absorbed non-kosher, have the ability to transfer to piece B?
Okay,
Question
I
today.
see,
Question, right?
see.
So the original case
So-
of Shulchan Aruch is if they're both, doesn't discuss whether they're lean or fatty, piece A and B. The only
Right.
discusses if the absorption was fatty. And if the absorption of piece A was fatty, then it could transfer to piece B. What I understand you're asking is, which is a very good question, discussed in the commentaries, in the Bach, and in the Shach and others, is if piece A and B are both kosher, piece A is fatty, and it absorbed non-kosher flavor. And
Right.
the kosher flavor is not fatty, let's say. But it itself is fatty. Does that itself become the liquid by which it can transfer to piece B? And we had this before. But in a different case, not in absorption. We had this before where you had two pieces of meat touching each other. And we said two pieces of meat touching each other. If one is fatty, it can transfer. One's kosher, one's non-kosher. Right? In this case, both are kosher, but one absorbed non-kosher. In the previous Sif, in Sif Zion involved, the case was one kosher, one non-kosher. And we said that if one of them, even if the kosher one is fatty, it becomes the liquid by which it transfers. Which means, in the previous Sif, the kosher fatty can provide liquid for the non-kosher meat to extract its flavor and bring it in.
It becomes usher.
And becomes non-kosher.
Becomes not kosher.
The question is now the same thing happened here. If piece number A, which is kosher, absorbs non-kosher meat flavor, but piece A itself is fatty, does it then provide the liquid by which the non-kosher absorption will then transfer to piece B? Good question. Yeah, and it's discussed in the commentaries. And essentially it's as follows. The Torah, so the Torah, which is a precursor to Shulchan Aruch, seems to make a little bit of contradiction. And the question is how you reconcile the contradiction, and that becomes the way in which you understand the halacha. Because the Torah himself says that whether or not the piece of meat that absorbed the non-kosher is fatty or not, it never transfers to the next thing unless it has liquid. In other words, its own fat will not become the liquid by which it transfers. That's the Torah's view. And the Beis Yosef is very curious about this. Beis Yosef, who's the author of the Shulchan Aruch, his commentary on the Torah, is questions it. We're talking about this liquid here, right? But nonetheless, the Shulchan Aruch doesn't make any distinction. The Shulchan Aruch here doesn't make any distinction and say if the fatty piece is fat, if the kosher piece is fatty, when it absorbs the non-kosher, then it transfers. Doesn't say that. So how do you square that away? And that becomes the big question. And the conclusion is as follows. So some indeed conclude that the fattiness to create a liquid that allows for transference is only when the fattiness itself is not forbidden, but not when it absorbs non-forbidden. There are those who conclude that way, the shach, which would mean, in our case, only if the absorption is fatty will it transfer to the next piece. But if the absorption is not fatty, even if the meat itself is fatty, it will not transfer because it's 2 steps removed. Yeah, that's the shach's view. However, in Darkei Moshe, which is the commentary of the Ramah on the Torah, it seems like he takes the more stringent view that if the kosher piece of meat is itself fatty, it does then take the flavor that it absorbed and transfer it to the next piece of meat, which would be more stringent. So we have a dispute here, the Shach and the Darkei Moshe, but the Shach actually quotes Darkei Moshe too. So we don't really see how we conclude. Maybe we'll have to look out for the summaries to see how they conclude halachically. Yeah, so good question, and we have a machlekes. Okay, is that clear so far? Any questions before we go forward? No? Okay. Now the next thing that comes up is, in this din, is a very important principle. Again, it's very interesting how these words are not mentioned in the Shulchan Aruch, but we have to learn these words because they're principles. Like, for example, the words I said before, HaBolua, Yotze, Chaticha, Rotev is not mentioned in the Shulchan Aruch, but that's the principle, which is absorption doesn't exit from one piece to another without liquid. Now, just stop as an aside, why doesn't the Shulchan Aruch mention all these details? So it's just interesting to note, and we should know this, and I think it'll help us understand the Shulchan Aruch's methodology if we understand this little bit of history. The Beis Yosef, the Shulchan Aruch is written by Rabbi Yosef Cairo. He's also the author of the Beis Yosef, right? The Beis Yosef is an elaborate commentary on the Torah. The Torah is written, so the Beis Yosef lives in the 1500s, and the Torah is written earlier in the let's say the 1300s, the 1400s, and the Torah is the son of the Rosh, Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher, and he's the first one to make like a code, post Rambam. Rambam also wrote a code, but he's the first one to make the codes that we follow. Let's just say that. So what the Beis Yosef did is he wrote a very elaborate commentary on the Torah, in which it's actually incredibly amazing because he basically synthesizes and summarizes all of the preceding thinking that goes before the Torah, then analyzes it and gives his own opinion. So you can like not even learn the Gemara, just learn the Torah and the Beis Yosef, because the Beis Yosef will quote the relevant Gemaras, the relevant halachic authorities that come after the Gemara that lead up to the Torah, and then he'll give his own analysis and his own conclusion. That's his commentary on the Beis Yosef, and it's a similar thing in the morning. A similar thing in his Kesef Mishnah, which is a commentary to the Rambam. Similar thing. You read Rambam and you read Kesef Mishnah. The Kesef Mishnah, which is written also by the Beis Yosef, by the Beis of Cairo, it's also a summary of all the Gemaras and all the relevant opinions that precede the Rambam and then his analysis of it. Now, the Shulchan Aruch, as you're learning, has no analysis, and it's written very, very brief, extremely brief, right? Now, why is he doing that? So the Beis of Cairo, in his introduction to the Shulchan Aruch, explains. He says, "Look, I wrote two, specifically one on the Torah, but two very elaborate halachic works that give you the analysis and the thinking. Now, if you're a Jew that wants to follow the Shulchan Aruch, sorry, there's no Shulchan Aruch, he's the author. But if you're a Jew that wants to follow Jewish law, let's say follow halacha, to rely on and to constantly refer back to this long analysis is getting impossible to know what to do. So I'm going to write for you a brief summary of all the conclusions, which I hope you will review once every 30 days. He writes that. He wants the Shulchan Aruch, the entire Shulchan Aruch, to be reviewed every 30 days.
Ambitious.
Yeah. And then these little conclusions will remind you of all of these little conclusions in the Shulchan Aruch will remind you of all the analysis that you already learned because you read my Beis Yosef. So the Shulchan Aruch you're buying does not reflect the original Beis Yosef Shulchan Aruch's intention. We're buying, this is only what, not even, this is like 10% of the Shulchan Aruch. This book right here, right? When you open up the page, how much of it is actually Shulchan Aruch? Not even 10%. Not even 10% of the page. So if you just had a book of the Shulchan Aruch without any commentary, it would be a small pamphlet, the whole thing. And that's how he wanted it. And if you look at the original printings, that's indeed how it was. The original printing of the Shulchan Aruch have no commentaries. It's just the conclusion. And some of them are even pocket size. We have such copies. And the front cover says, this is being printed pocket size because you want to keep to your 30-day review. So when you're traveling, you don't want to miss out. So here's your pocket size Shulchan Aruch that you can carry with you and review every 30 days and never miss out, right? So this explains why the Shulchan Aruch sometimes is very cryptic and doesn't, I'm saying this in the context here because I'm giving you all this background and all these phrasings that the Shulchan Aruch doesn't even have. Like, why isn't it in the Shulchan Aruch? So now you understand why. Because if you go to the Beis Yosef, it's all going to be there. And he's expecting you have already learned that. And now you're just reading your review. So in the review, he's not going to repeat all the principles every single time. But it's impossible to know the Shulchan Aruch without knowing those principles. Right? So just to give a little context to how the Shulchan Aruch came about, and when you're reading it, just to know why sometimes there's so much more, and the Shulchan Aruch doesn't even mention any of it. Okay. Yeah, clear? All right, so principle number 2 is as follows. The Shulchan Aruch mentioned that the basic principle here is that when the piece itself is kosher, it's only non-kosher because it absorbs something, then it's a lesser degree and therefore won't transfer unless there's actual liquid. That was the principle. Now the Shulchan Aruch writes a list of stuff, gives 2 examples for that which is in Aser Machmas Atzmai, that it itself is forbidden rather than having absorbed forbidden. 2 examples. One, he says, is Neveila. Neveila is a kosher piece of meat that wasn't slaughtered, and that's why it's not kosher. That's example 1 he gives. Now you could give other examples. For example, treifa. If you shechted a meat kosher, but you found out that the lung had a puncture, right? That would be treifa. But he doesn't use such examples. Or for the same price in a piece of chazer, a piece of pig, he could have said that. Also doesn't say that. What's his second example? Except his second example is basar b'chalav, milk and meat. What's your question? The whole premise of this is with a piece of meat is inherently non-kosher, and that's when it transfers. But if it only absorbs non-kosher, then it doesn't transfer unless it has liquid. Milk and meat is inherently non-kosher. What exactly is your scenario here? Explain to me a case in milk and meat where there's an inherent non-kosher. Seemingly, either it's a kosher piece of meat that absorbed milk, or it's a piece of kosher milk which absorbs flavor of meat. What exactly are you talking about when you say that milk and meat is inherently non-kosher and therefore it can transfer? Is not the whole premise of milk and meat absorption? So what's going on here? Clear? It's a very strong question, which Taz addresses. Now, to understand this, we have to understand the principle called Chaticha, Naaseh, Neveila. Chaticha, Naaseh, Neveila, which means the piece becomes, Neveila again is that word for non-slaughtered kosher meat. So Neveila is another way of saying a non-kosher piece of meat. The piece becomes non-kosher. That's basically another way of saying it. In abbreviated, it'll often be referred to as Chanan. Like the name Chanan, Ches Nun Nun, Chaticha Naaseh Neveila. Bookmark this phrasing because it's going to come up, especially when we get to Tzadik Beis, and after we finish Kafeh, we're going to be going to the laws of Basar B'chalav. Chanan is going to be very, very relevant. Chaticha Naaseh Neveila, which means the piece itself becomes non-kosher. So let's understand the principle of this. So you have a kosher piece of meat, and it absorbed a little bit of milk. Now, this piece of meat which absorbed milk, and there's no 60 times meat to the ratio of milk. Right? So it's non-kosher now. Now this piece of meat fell into a stew. Now I need to have 60 times kosher to non-kosher. So what's the ratio of 60 to 0 I need to have? Do I need to have 60 times in the stew to the ratio of milk?
Or the piece.
Or 60 times to the ratio of the piece of meat, which is much bigger. Why? Why do I have to have 60 times to the ratio of the piece of meat? Because Chaticha Naaseh Neveila, this piece itself became a non-kosher piece of meat, even though it's only by dint of absorption of milk. But once it absorbed milk and now became an item of non-kosher by dint of milk and meat, now it's not just that there's a kosher piece of meat that absorbed milk. It itself is non-kosher.
not Tom. The Basar B'chol is not everything. The other one's mostly Tom. It's because I'll take Basar B'chol itself. It's inherited.
That's the big question now. That's a very big question. You just hit the nail on the head. That's the big question here. When we say that Chaticha Naaseh Neveila, that the piece itself now becomes a non-kosher piece of meat, is that true of itself, or is that true also its flavor? Also its flavor.
So you're saying like imagine some non-kosher wine spilt on it, or something like.
No. Let's okay. So Chaticha Naaseh Neveila is unique to milk and meat,
I understand.
right?
I'm curious
So
about the flavor.
So okay, so let's use wine. So till now we say you have two pieces of kosher meat, not one absorbed non-kosher wine. So okay, that wouldn't be a good example because the wine itself, let's say, okay, does wine count as fatty? Wine's not necessarily fatty.
No.
Okay, wine's not fatty. So in that case, no transference, okay, and there's no stew, it's just two pieces of meat touching each other. That would be the law of our case, where because this is absorbed non-kosher, it doesn't transfer to the next.
Okay.
Right. Now what happens if the piece of meat absorbed milk? And now it's touching. So if we take the principle absolute, that Chaticha Naaseh Neveila, this piece of meat now became a non-kosher piece of meat. So it doesn't matter if this piece of meat will transfer milk, irrelevant. It itself is non-kosher. So even if all it transfers is its own flavor, that own flavor is non-kosher.
You just have to cut off the piece of that other meat like we learned before.
Then if it's fatty, it would transfer the whole way, or kedei netila, or the amount of the peel, right? But the point is that the piece of meat that absorbed the milk doesn't need to transfer the actual milk. It only needs to transfer its own flavor, which it could do. Because the principle that HaBolua is HaBolua, that which is absorbed does not transfer between one piece and another without liquid. But in the case of milk and meat, it doesn't need to transfer that which it absorbed. It just needs to transfer its own flavor, because its own flavor isn't kosher, because Chaticha Naaseh Neveila, because the piece itself became non-kosher. So it doesn't need to transfer the milk. It transfers its own flavor. That's enough. That would be the Shulchan Aruch's view, which is an extreme view, because you're taking this notion of Chaticha Naaseh Neveila, that the piece itself becomes non-kosher, and taking it not just for itself, but even for its flavor. And if for the flavor it gives off, itself isn't kosher, even if it doesn't give off the flavor of the milk. That would be the view of the Shulchan Aruch. However, the Taz disagrees. He quotes the Rashal. The Rashal is getting a little redemption, because in the previous cases, the Rashal has been the one who's been very, very stringent. Right? He's been very stringent in the past. Where do we have him being stringent? We had him being stringent with respect to, remember? With respect to, I'll tell you where he had him being stringent, where he said that absorption into a vessel, into a utensil, doesn't get the leniency of the bottom being overpowering. It gets treated as equal, and the flavor is transferred completely. Right? He was the one that was stringent, but here he's going to be lenient. And the Taz views is, he says nope. Right? So, yeah, so the Taz brings the Rashal, who says no, milk and meat is considered absorption, and therefore it won't transfer to the next unless it has liquid in between. Unlike the Shulchan Aruch, which said the milk and meat itself becomes a thing that's forbidden and transfers flavor, and it's no good. Yeah. Yeah. And therefore, he says that when the Shulchan Aruch, if you want to maintain the Shulchan Aruch's view, then we have to conclude that the Shulchan Aruch is speaking of where the piece of meat itself was so hot that it absorbed milk completely, and thus became mamish. Every piece of flavor that comes out of the piece of meat is milk and meat together. That's what you have to explain the Shulchan Aruch if you want to maintain that view. And the Gra again agrees with that, because indeed the Rashba himself, who's the source of this law, he himself writes that a piece of meat that absorbed flavor doesn't become a Neveila as a result, and therefore will not transfer the flavor unless there's a liquid in between. And the Rashba is the one that's the source of this view. Right? Now, the Shach adds, and you'll see this in the Shulchan Aruch, you'll see this in the summaries. Eliyahu Hanavi gets involved here because the Shach writes that we have to conclude basically if we want to maintain, if we, what did he say? We want to maintain the Rashba in its entirety. That that milk and meat is considered absorption and not considered usher on its own, then we have to accept it's as if this is Shach words quoted from the Tumas Hadeshin. It's as if Eliyahu Hanavi standing there and telling the piece of meat, I'm sorry, only flavor of meat can go out, no milk can go out. And therefore the milk that it absorbed doesn't go into the next piece of meat. Because Eliyahu Hanavi is there. In other words, halacha is there determining, we're sorry, the milk doesn't transfer, only the meat flavor transfers, and therefore no forbidden flavors going to the next piece of meat. If we wanted to maintain the rashba on its own origin, rather than the Shulchan Aruch, who says that the milk and meat itself becomes forbidden, and the flavor does transfer. Okay. However, and we're going to see this also again in the summaries, the Shach concludes that nonetheless, you see, all the commentaries dance back and forth because they want to maintain the Shulchan Aruch, which describes milk and meat becoming inherently forbidden, but they also want to maintain the Rashba, who said that it's considered absorption. So he's going to conclude, nonetheless, that the flavor of the meat itself is non-kosher, even if the milk doesn't expel, because the flavor itself became Neveila, became non-kosher, and therefore, even if the milk doesn't expel, the meat itself now has become non-kosher, and therefore its flavor itself transfers, right? That's what he's trying to maintain, maintaining the Shulchan Aruch's view. But it concludes that the transference will only be the amount of a significant removal, which is the 2 centimeters mentioned before. Why? Because we already concluded earlier that when two pieces of non-kosher that are hot touching each other will only transfer, unless there's of course fattiness or liquid, it'll only transfer up to kedei netila, only up to that 2 centimeters, and that would be the maximum here anyway. Even if we were to take the view of the Shulchan Aruch that the milk and meat itself is inherently forbidden, it's only going to transfer as much as kedei netila, as much as the significant removal, which is the 2 centimeters. Okay, and here too, we already said this. We will concede, and Ramah will concede to the Shulchan Aruch that we could distinguish between fatty and liquid. Clear? And therefore, if the meat is lean, we're not going to say the flavor goes all the way. It only goes kedei netila up to 2 centimeters. But if we see that it's fatty, then we'll move between one and the other, even if it's a milk and meat issue, because again, we treat the whole piece of meat, Chanan, Chaticha, Naaseh, Neveila, the piece itself becomes non-kosher. Okay.
So the 2 centimeters of the meat is the shishim against only that mass.
You would still have to remove the point of contact.
I'm saying you have to remove it, but
yes. So
but it would be the whole stew would be permitted.
If there's no stew. If it's stew, then it transfers. You have liquid now, right?
Oh, there's no liquid.
No liquid here. 2 pieces touching each other.
Oh, okay.
Even if you don't have 60 in the whole mass, you just have to remove the point of contact, and that's it.
Right.
Transfer anymore, unless it's fatty, which makes liquid and therefore transfers the whole way, and then you have to have 60 against the whole thing.
You have to have 60, so not just a 2-inch mass.
If it's fatty or liquidy, yes.
Right.
Otherwise, just a 2-inch, just a 2 centimeters. Okay. Final point in Sif Zion. Are we clear so far? Comments, questions? We're clear? Okay. Final point in this week's quota on Sif Zion. There's another Sif, which is Sif Ches. Again, I'm not going to really spend too much time on it. You'll read it. It's pretty self-understood. Number 8, and not very common because it's talking about grilling a liver, Kulya's kidneys in and of itself, with the membrane, and whether the transfer goes between the membrane and not the membrane. So we're going to leave that alone because again, the Ramah is stringent and ignores the membrane and says the transfer does go between anyway. So it doesn't really matter. Even though the Shulchan Aruch says we treat the membrane as a separation. So last final piece of Sif Zion, which is again the beef of our quota. The Ramah writes. So now, what happens? We're going to do the same principle, where you have absorption on the one hand, 2 kosher items. One is forbidden via absorption, but now we're not going to think about two pieces of meat, one which absorbed non-kosher flavor, but a kosher piece of meat touching a pot, where the pot absorbed non-kosher. And do we see this? Do we say the same leniency that flavor isn't transferred between absorbed flavor isn't transferred between one thing and another without liquid, which means I have a non-kosher pot, the pot absorbed non-kosher, and then I put a kosher piece of meat without any liquid or without any gravy. Does transference happen between the pot and the piece of meat? If it's two pieces of meat, the answer we said was no, unless it's fatty. Because the absorption will not transfer from one piece to another without liquid. So here it's again absorption from one item to another, but here the absorption is in the vessel, not in the piece of meat. Yeah. So a pot that absorbed non-kosher, that's now touching a kosher piece of meat. The Ramah here is stringent and says that when it comes to a vessel, there is expelling of flavor even without a liquid. What's the rationale? What's the rationale? Because, what was the rationale? The rationale was like this. Food itself, actually, there's a simple logic here. You could never kosherize food. Why can't you kosherize food? When it comes to a pot that's not kosher, so you boil it up to the same degree that it absorbed and then it expels. But you can't do that to a piece of meat. You can't take a kosher piece of meat, boil it up and say, oh, the flavor is expelled now. Why not? Because the nature of food is, because it itself is a item of flavor, the nature is to absorb flavor and mix with its own flavor. And therefore the expelling won't happen in the same way where it expels all of its flavor. To fucking do that. So if you boil a piece of meat and you take it out, it now has no flavor, and all the flavor transferred to the liquid, and then now the meat is flavorless. That's not true. Because the nature of food is to retain its own flavor and to absorb and expel. But even when the flavor is expelled from food, it still retains that same flavor that it expelled. And that's not true of pots. Pots itself are not, or vessels themselves aren't themselves designed to be flavor absorbers, and therefore either absorb and expel, no problem. And therefore, the pot, says the Ramah, does not require liquid to expel its flavor. And therefore, if the pot itself absorbs non-kosher, it will expel into the kosher meat, even though there's no liquid, unlike two pieces of meat next to each other. There's a stringency there. Which is, of course, only true if the piece of meat is completely dry. If it's liquidy, then again, no, 1 second. Oh, but the Shach brings that this absorption that the kosher meat will have from the non-kosher flavor that's absorbed in the pot will only be kadei klipa, the peel. It'll only be the peel, not the entire flavor, unless it's fatty, in which case it'll absorb the whole thing all the way. It's got liquid.
That's more stringent than two pieces of meat together, right? That's dry and not liquidy.
Than meat, correct. That's more stringent than two pieces of meat because we treat the pot that its ability to expel is absolute, as opposed to two pieces of meat where the flavor expelling of a food is less absolute than the flavor expelling of a pot.
Mhm.
Oh.
Correct. More stringent.
Therefore requires liquid.
Yes. But nonetheless, there are those who disagree with the Shach, the Magen Avram, who writes, even if the meat is fatty, it still will not make it will still not absorb from the pot in its entirety, only kadei klipa, only if it has only the amount of a peel. So you have a dispute there as to to what degree does the extraction of flavor from the pot absorbed in the kosher meat, if there is fat or if there's no fat, to what degree does it go? That's going to be a dispute that's going to come up in the summaries. And finally, the closing halacha, which we already spoke about last
And all this we're talking about, and all this we're talking about a pot that's ben yoma, right?
Yeah, only if it's ben yom, yes. If
Yeah.
it's over 24 hours and the flavor is negative, it doesn't matter anyway. Yes, correct. It's only if it's
Right.
24 hours, yes. And finally, final halacha, which we spoke about already last week, is since we're talking about two dried items and absorption and whether that goes from one to the other. So we spoke about this last week, that a pot or a vessel that absorbed non-kosher flavor will not expel its flavor to a different pot unless there's liquid between the two, unless there's food between the two. Right, we spoke about this last week.
Right.
Non-kosher stove,
Airplane.
and you put a pot on top. If it's perfectly clean, no transference between one and the other. But if there's any bit of food, then it will transfer, which is why again we're stringent, because it's going to be spillage and there's going to be food. But in theory, at least, vessel touching a vessel does not transfer flavor from one to the next unless there's liquid in between. And again, as I mentioned, that's the principle of double wrapping.
So
Double
even
wrapping.
If it's hot.
So even if it's hot, right? So that's the principle of double wrapping, because you have your airplane food in silver foil. So that silver foil is touching the food itself. And then you have another piece of silver foil around. And that other silver foil, let's say, is absorbing the flavor from the non-kosher food. But that silver foil that's on the outside, absorbing from the non-kosher food, will not transfer to the silver foil that's touching your food because it's completely dry between the two. There's no liquid. Yeah. And that again is built, it's largely built on our halacha here, but it's going to come up again in something base when we get to milk and meat. But same principle, which is ein HaBolua Yotze Chaticha Rotev. That which is absorbed doesn't transfer from one thing to another unless there's liquid in between. And that's a summary of, or the intro of the various different things that we're going to be seeing this week. And the halacha ches is again with respect to grilling kidneys and whether the membrane serves as a barrier between the kidney and that which is not kosher, and that Ramah ignores the barrier anyway. And that's pretty much a summary of this week. Any questions, thoughts before we close? Okay, so this is our last week before Tishrei break. With Hashem's help, after Tishrei, we conclude Simin Kuf Hey. Have a wonderful day, everybody. A good Tavach, and better is alles gut.
Thank you so much, Rabbi.
A good
Rotev and Masuka.
We're doing next.
Sorry?
Do you know which Siman we're doing
After
next?
Kufay, we're going to Basar B'chalav.
And then
We're
go back
basically
to
we're
this
gonna be going back and forth quite a bit because we're going, instead of in order, we're going by idea.
Okay.
So Kufay is about absorption,
Right.
and in Kufay we're talking about the principles of absorption of kosher to non-kosher, and then we're going to transfer those same principles to milk and meat absorption. It's going to be the same principle. Now we're learning it between kosher and non-kosher, and then we're going to learn on something base between milk and meat. But it's going to be the same principle of how absorption happens,
Okay, very cool.
okay, which is really the premise of the whole entire thing, which is why we're starting with this. Okay, wonderful day, buddy. Good luck.
Did you invent this order?
No, I did not.
No, he's copying
I'm
the
taking it from Laman Yonah.
Okay, because
Even though Rabbi Shachat's not doing this order, I don't know why. Rabbi Shachat's going in order, it's time to pay Zion.
because
They started from the beginning and moving
He's
on.
starting from the beginning.
somebody else in the
I don't know why. I
dude
think
told
it's a
me
60-year
they,
thing. I don't
they
know
were
why.
doing it in a different order, or they did it in a different order. They started with Batir Chalab, then they went to
I think
maybe they
1 year or
caught
2 year track.
1 year.
Interesting. I don't know why they gave me this, but I'm very happy with it. I'm very happy with this order.
Okay.
Listen, it's easier this way if you have it's because we have like a proper plan, so you can follow along and we can do it this way. If you just have to learn it this way, it'd be very confusing to switch back and forth constantly.
Yeah, I
But
suppose so. Yeah.
because we have an actual plan.
Yeah, I suppose so. Okay, have a good luck, everybody.
I'm sad.